In the summer of 1565, the Ottoman Empire launched the largest naval invasion the Mediterranean had ever seen. 40,000 soldiers, the finest janissaries, cannons that had shattered Constantinople itself. Their target was a sun-scorched island, barely 20 miles long, defended by fewer than 500 knights and a handful of local militiamen. By every calculation, Malta should have fallen in weeks. The defenders had no reinforcements coming, no escape route, no second chance. But behind those limestone walls stood men who had sworn never to retreat, warriors of the Order of St. John, exiled from Rhodes, with nowhere left to run, and leading them was a 70-year-old Grand Master who had already decided how this siege would end. Not with surrender, not with negotiation, with blood, theirs or his. By the middle of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become the most powerful force on earth. Under Suleiman, the Magnificent, its armies had conquered Belgrade, crushed Hungary at Mohacs, and stood at the gates of Vienna. Its fleets controlled the eastern Mediterranean, from Constantinople to the coasts of North Africa. And yet there remained one small obstacle, one stubborn wound that Suleiman had never fully healed: the Knights of St. John. For centuries, these warrior monks had defended Christendom from their island fortress of Rhodes, blocking Ottoman expansion and raiding Muslim shipping with ruthless efficiency. In 1522, Suleiman had finally driven them out after a brutal 6-month siege, but he had allowed them to leave with their weapons, their banners, and their pride intact. It was a decision he came to regret. The knights wandered for years until the Holy Roman Emperor granted them a new home, a sun-scorched rock in the central Mediterranean called Malta. The island was barely 20 miles long. Its harbours were narrow, its soil thin, its summers punishing. Fresh water was scarce, and the heat could kill a man in armour before any enemy raised a blade. But the knights saw what others missed. They saw deep harbours that could shelter a fleet. They saw limestone cliffs that could be carved into walls. They saw a position so perfectly placed that whoever held Malta controlled the sea lanes between Europe and Africa, between the Christian West and the Ottoman East. For 43 years, they fortified, they trained, and they waited. They knew Suleiman would come. They knew he would bring everything, and they knew that if Malta fell, there would be no third home, no further retreat. This barren island would be their grave or their glory. There was no other outcome. The man who would lead Malta's defense was 70 years old when the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon. Jean de Valette had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. He had fought at Rhodes as a young knight and watched his brothers retreat in defeat. He had been captured by Ottoman corsairs and spent a year chained to an oar in a Muslim galley, rowing until his hands bled and his back bore the scars of the lash. He had been ransomed, returned to the order, and risen through its ranks with a single burning purpose: never again, never another retreat, never another surrender. By 1565, Valette had become Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, and he ruled with an iron will forged by decades of suffering. He was not a man who gave speeches about glory or destiny. He simply made clear that every knight, every soldier, every man, woman, and child on Malta would fight until they won or died. There would be no middle ground. To ensure no one harbored thoughts of escape, he ordered every boat on the island destroyed. The message was unmistakable: we stay, we fight, we hold, or we fall together. Across the water, the Ottoman commanders prepared an invasion force that should have crushed Malta in weeks. Mustafa Pasha led the army, a veteran of countless campaigns who approached siege warfare with methodical patience. Piale Pasha commanded the fleet, younger and more ambitious, eager to prove himself worthy of the Sultan's favour. And then there was Dragut, the legendary corsair whom Suleiman had personally summoned from his North African stronghold. Dragut was perhaps the finest siege tactician in the Mediterranean, a man whose very name made Christian sailors cross themselves in fear. Together they commanded nearly 40,000 soldiers, including the elite janissaries, the finest infantry in the world, supported by an artillery train capable of reducing any fortress to rubble. Against this force, Valette had fewer than 500 Knights of St. John. He had perhaps 400 Spanish soldiers sent by a reluctant King Philip, and he had the Maltese themselves, 3,000 or 4,000 farmers and fishermen who had never faced anything like what was coming, but who understood that their homes, their families, and their faith hung in the balance. The mathematics of the siege were simple and brutal. The Ottomans outnumbered the defenders by nearly 10-1. Their cannons could fire more rounds in a single day than Malta possessed in its entire arsenal. Every military mind in Europe expected the island to fall before summer ended. But numbers do not account for everything. They do not measure will, they do not weigh the desperation of men with nowhere left to run, and they do not factor in a 70-year-old Grand Master who had already decided that this island would become either a Christian fortress or a Christian tomb. The Ottoman commanders understood that before they could assault the main fortifications of Birgu and Senglia, they had to neutralize the small star-shaped fort that guarded the entrance to both of Malta's critical harbours. Fort St. Elmo sat at the tip of the Skiberus Peninsula, a modest defensive work barely large enough to hold a few hundred men, but its position made it essential. As long as St. Elmo stood, the Ottoman fleet could not safely anchor in either Grand Harbour or Marsamxet, leaving the entire invasion force exposed to the open sea and any storms that might arise. The knights knew the fort could not survive a determined assault. Its walls were too thin, its garrison too small, its position too exposed, but they also knew that every day St. Elmo held was another day for the promised relief force from Sicily to arrive, and so Valette sent his men into the fort with orders that left no room for hope. Hold as long as possible. Expect no rescue, die well. The Ottoman bombardment began in late May, and it was unlike anything the defenders had ever experienced. Dozens of heavy cannons poured fire into St. Elmo from dawn until dark, thousands of rounds slamming into the limestone walls until entire sections collapsed into rubble. The defenders worked through the nights, hauling stones and timber to rebuild what the cannons had destroyed, knowing that each repair would be undone by the next sunrise. When Dragut arrived from North Africa, he surveyed the siege with his practiced eye and immediately repositioned the artillery to create overlapping fields of fire. Now St. Elmo was being struck from multiple angles at once, and the fort that had seemed merely difficult to hold became a death trap. The assaults came in waves. Janissaries stormed the breaches with their legendary discipline, climbing over the rubble of shattered walls, while the knights met them with swords and pikes and a terrifying new weapon, iron hoops wrapped in flaming cloth that stuck to armor and flesh and burned men alive where they stood. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, medieval in its intimacy despite the modern artillery that had made it possible. Each night the defenders carried their wounded back into the fort's shrinking interior. Each morning they dragged their dead to the walls and used the bodies to fill gaps in the defenses. Messages crossed the harbour to Valette, pleading for relief or permission to withdraw. His response never varied. There would be no rescue. There would be no retreat. Hold until death. The siege of St. Elmo lasted 31 days. 31 days of constant bombardment. 31 days of nightly repairs and daily assaults. 31 days of watching the garrison shrink from hundreds to dozens to a final handful of wounded men who could barely lift their swords. During those 31 days, a cannonball fragment struck Dragut as he observed the siege from a forward position. The greatest corsair of his age, the man Suleiman had sent specifically to ensure victory, died before ever seeing St. Elmo fall. His loss would haunt the Ottoman command for the rest of the campaign. On June 23, 1565, the Ottomans finally overran what remained of the fort. Only 9 defenders survived the final assault, all of them too wounded to fight, all of them executed where they lay. The cost was staggering. Between 6,000 and 8,000 Ottoman soldiers had died taking a position the size of a city block. When Mustafa Pasha finally walked through the smoking ruins and looked across the harbour at the far larger fortifications of Birgu and Senglia, he is said to have muttered that if the daughter cost so much, what price would the mother demand? In his fury, he ordered the bodies of the fallen knights beheaded, their corpses lashed to wooden crosses, and floated across the harbour to Birgu as a message of what awaited the survivors. Valette received the message and sent one of his own. He ordered every Ottoman prisoner in Maltese hands beheaded and fired their heads from cannons back into the enemy camp. Whatever pretense of civilized warfare had existed was now abandoned. St. Elmo had not been meant to survive. It had been meant to bleed the enemy, to buy time, to prove that Malta would extract a terrible price for every inch of ground. It had done all of that and more. Now the real siege would begin. With the fall of St. Elmo, the Ottomans, turned their full attention to the twin cities that formed the heart of Malta's defense. Birgu and Sengler sat on two narrow peninsulas jutting into Grand Harbour, connected by a chain and a wooden pontoon bridge that allowed defenders to move between them. Birgu was anchored by Fort St. Angelo, the strongest position on the island, while Sengler was protected by Fort St. Michael and a series of hastily constructed walls. Together, these fortifications held everything that remained of Christian Malta, not just the surviving knights and soldiers, but the entire civilian population, thousands of Maltese men, women and children who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. Mustafa Pasha began his assault on these positions with the same methodical brutality that had eventually broken St. Elmo. Ottoman batteries were positioned on the heights of Skibaras and on Mount Salvador, overlooking Senglia, and day after day they poured fire into both cities. The post of Castile, a section of Birgo's walls that everyone knew to be the weakest point in the entire defensive line, received particular attention. Stones crumbled, gaps appeared, and still the defenders held, filling breaches with rubble by night and dying in them by day. On July 15th, the Ottomans launched their first major assault against Senglia. Wave after wave of janissaries and Dialas stormed the walls of Fort St. Michael, pushing so deep into the fortifications that for several terrible hours it seemed the position would be overrun. The counterattack that saved Senglia was not led by knights alone. Maltese women carried stones and boiling water to the ramparts. Old men who had never held a sword took up whatever weapons they could find. Children ran messages through streets choked with smoke and debris. The entire population fought with the desperate fury of people defending their homes, their families, their faith. That night, a small group of knights stripped off their armor and swam across the harbor in darkness to reinforce the battered garrison of St. Michael. They arrived exhausted and immediately took their places on the walls. There would be no rest for anyone. The Ottomans adapted quickly, realizing that their fleet could not enter Grand Harbour while the fortifications remained intact. They dragged dozens of small boats overland from Marsamset to the shores below Senglia. On August 7th, they launched the most dangerous assault of the entire siege, a simultaneous attack by land and sea, designed to overwhelm the defenders from multiple directions at once. Ottoman boats filled with soldiers rowed towards Senglia's waterfront, while infantry stormed the walls from the landward side. For a moment it seemed that nothing could prevent the position from collapsing. Then the hidden battery opened fire. Valette had secretly positioned a group of cannons in a spot overlooking the approach to Senglia, and when the Ottoman boats came within range, the guns tore them apart. Soldiers drowned in the harbour or were cut down as they struggled to reach shore. On the walls above, the knights and Maltese militia threw back the land assault in some of the most vicious hand-to-hand fighting of the siege. Valette himself appeared at the post of Castile during the height of the crisis. Despite a serious leg wound that would trouble him for the rest of his life, he fought alongside his men in the breach, refusing to withdraw until the Ottoman assault had been repulsed. His presence at the point of greatest danger sent an unmistakable message to every defender on Malta. If the Grand Master would bleed for these walls, then no one else had any excuse to hold back. But the siege was far from over. The Ottomans began digging mines beneath the fortifications, tunneling through the rock in hopes of collapsing entire sections of wall from below. The defenders responded with countermines of their own, and soon a nightmarish war was being fought in the darkness beneath the earth. Men encountered each other in narrow tunnels and fought with knives and bare hands, while engineers on both sides placed explosive charges and prayed their tunnels held. Explosions ripped through Birga's streets at unpredictable intervals, sometimes opening new breaches that had to be defended before the Ottomans could exploit them. The weeks dragged on and conditions inside the fortifications grew desperate. Water ran low, disease spread through the crowded streets. The dead could not be properly buried and had to be stacked in makeshift morgues while the living continued to fight. Some of Valette's advisors urged him to evacuate the civilians to Fort St. Angelo, the last truly defensible position on the island. He refused absolutely. If the civilians were removed from Birga and Senglia, the soldiers would know the end was coming. Everyone would fight together, or everyone would die together. There could be no other way. Across the lines, Ottoman morale was crumbling under the weight of endless casualties, summer heat and disease. Mustafa Pasha considered withdrawal more than once. but the thought of returning to Constantinople empty-handed after Suleiman had invested so much in the campaign was unbearable, and so the siege continued, week after bloody week, with neither side willing to give way. The defenders were running on nothing but will. Valette, limping from his wound and exhausted beyond any normal measure of endurance, told his knights that every day might be their last. They would fight until relief arrived, or until every one of them lay dead. There was no longer any other consideration. For more than 4 months, the defenders of Malta had held on through a siege that should have broken them a dozen times over. They had fought in the breaches, in the tunnels, in the streets. They had watched their brothers die and buried them in shallow graves before returning to the walls. They had endured bombardment, assault, disease, and thirst, and through it all they had looked to the horizon, waiting for sails that never appeared. Don Garcia de Toledo, the viceroy of Sicily, had promised relief since the siege began, but month after month he delayed, uncertain whether his forces were sufficient, unwilling to risk a defeat at sea that might expose Sicily itself to Ottoman attack. Inside the fortifications, hope had become a kind of cruelty, something the defenders could not afford to feel. And then on September 7, 1565, after 130 days of siege, the sails finally appeared. Don Garcia landed approximately 8,000 Spanish and Italian troops on the northern coast of Malta, fresh soldiers who had not spent 4 months fighting for every inch of ground. The effect on both sides was immediate and dramatic. The defenders, many of whom had given up any real expectation of rescue, felt something like life return to their exhausted limbs. The Ottomans, depleted by months of casualties and weakened by disease and the brutal summer heat, saw the relief force and believed it to be far larger than it actually was. Mustafa Pasha's response was erratic. He ordered a withdrawal to the ships, then countermanded the order, then decided to attack the relief force before it could link up with the garrison. His army was no longer the confident juggernaut that had landed in May. It was a battered and demoralized force that had lost perhaps a third of its strength, taking a single small fort and failing to take anything else. The final battle occurred near the town of Naxar. Ottoman rearguard units clashed with the advancing relief force and broke almost immediately. There was no last stand, no final desperate assault. The army that had terrorized the Mediterranean for generations simply collapsed. Soldiers fled toward the beaches where the fleet waited. Thousands were left behind in the chaos of evacuation. Ottoman dead from the entire campaign numbered somewhere between 20 and 35,000 men, a catastrophic loss that stunned Constantinople and sent shockwaves across Europe. The defenders had paid their own terrible price. Approximately 2,500 had died, including some 250 knights of St. John. Malta itself lay in ruins, its fortifications shattered, its streets filled with rubble and the graves of the fallen, but the island remained unconquered. The cross still flew above the walls, and across Europe, church bells rang for a victory that almost no one had believed possible. In the years that followed the siege, Malta was transformed from a battered fortress into something permanent. Valette immediately began construction of a new city on the Sibiros Peninsula, the same ground where Fort St. Elmo had held for 31 desperate days. The city would bear his name, Valletta, and its walls would be built so strong that no enemy would ever again come close to breaking them. Money poured in from across Catholic Europe, from kings and popes and nobles who understood what Malta's survival had meant for all of Christendom. The Ottoman Empire never fully recovered from the humiliation. Suleiman the Magnificent died the following year, and though the empire remained formidable for generations, it never again mounted a major westward offensive in the Mediterranean. The Battle of Lepanto, 6 years later, would further shatter Ottoman naval power, but Malta had been the turning point, the moment when the seemingly unstoppable advance finally stopped. For Europe, the siege became something more than a military victory. It became proof that the Ottomans could be defeated, that courage and preparation and unity could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The story of Malta spread across the continent, inspiring songs and paintings and histories that kept the memory alive for centuries. The Knights of St. John remained on Malta for more than 200 years, until Napoleon expelled them in 1798. Their legacy endured in the fortifications they built and the traditions they preserved. Jean de Valette himself died in 1568, just 3 years after the siege, never seeing his city completed. His body was laid to rest in what would become St. John's Cathedral, surrounded by the tombs of the knights who had fought beside him. Today, visitors can still walk the streets of Valletta and trace the outlines of that impossible summer. The walls still stand, the harbour still gleams in the Mediterranean sun, and somewhere in the stone there remains an echo of what happened when a handful of men decided they would not run. A 70-year-old grandmaster, fewer than 500 knights, an island no one expected to survive, and they held,